Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar, I am Dr. Rema Devi, Professor and Head, Department of Anatomy from Pondicherry Institute of Medical Sciences. Today, the topic for discussion is arches of foot. So, before we go into the arches of foot, let us just look at a case scenario. Mr. X, a 21-year-old male, well built and healthy, went for recruitment in the army. After physical examination, he was rejected as he was having flat feet. Now, what is flat foot deformity? What are the various arches in the foot? What structures maintain the medial longitudinal arch? The answers to these questions we will get to know as we go through today's class. So, specific learning objectives for the day is introduction to the arches, classification of arches, basic principles of the arch and its supports, a description on the medial longitudinal arch, lateral longitudinal arch, transverse arches, and the applied anatomy pertaining to this. Coming on to the introduction, you know that the skeleton of the foot is segmented and arched both longitudinally and transversely with the concavity directed towards the plantar side. Now, let me repeat this. I am going for this. I have to hold like this and talk. So, before we go into the arches of foot, let me give you a small introduction to the skeleton of the foot. So, we have the tarsals and the metatarsals. Among the tarsals, we have the calcaneus, talus, cuboid, navicular, the three cuneiforms, medial, intermediate and lateral, and the metatarsals from medial to lateral 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. These are the metatarsal bones, and then we have the phalanges. The skeleton of the foot, as you have seen, is segmented, made of multiple bones and arched both longitudinally and transversely with the concavity of the arch directed towards the plantar aspect. So, what are the basic functions of the arches? The arches, if the bone, let me repeat, what are the functions of the arches? If the bone was a single one and functioned as a single entity during walking, it would have been difficult to maintain its the differences which happen at different levels of ground. So, all this is taken care of by the arch in its formation. So, the arches help in walking on irregular surfaces, running, jumping by acting as a segmented lever because of its specific construction. Here, it helps in the propulsive action of the gastrocnemius and soleus and allows the long flexors of the soles to act at the proximal part of the forefoot while setting in motion. At the same time, the lumbricals of the foot prevents the buckling of the toes once when they are acted upon by the long flexors of the foot. The arches designed in an elastic form acts as a pliable platform supporting the weight of the body and in proportional distribution of body weight. So, the body weight is equally taken up by both the foot. So, each of the foot shares or takes up half the body weight. So, looking at one of the foot, the body weight is transmitted vertically through the talus and distributed again equally between the calcaneus on the posterior aspect and the front of the foot, that is by the metatarsals on the anterior aspect. Now, looking at the metatarsals, we find arches designed in an elastic form acts as a pliable platform supporting the body weight in proportional distribution of body weight. The body weight is equally taken up by both the feet. So, in other words, each of the foot bears half the body weight. This foot, as a single foot, when you take it up, the body weight is transmitted through the talar joints and again shared equally between the posterior part, that is the calcaneus, and by the anterior part, that is by the metatarsal bones. Having taken up in the anterior aspect, the anterior bones, the 5 metatarsal bones together have got 6 bearing points in the fact that the first metatarsal bone has got 2 sesamoid bones which also take up the weight of the body. So, there are 6 points by which the anterior portion of the foot. So, the weight taken up by the metatarsals are at 6 bearing points, with the first metatarsal taking up the weight at 2 points because of the 2 sesamoid bones bearing the weight, and so there are 6 points by which the metatarsals take up the weight. So, in other words, the first metatarsal takes up double the weight than what is borne by the other metatarsals. This is very clearly evident by the bulky or the stouty nature of the first metatarsal, and the weight bearing other element is the calcaneus, which is also large and strong. So, this demonstrates how the body takes up the weight through the calcaneus and the first metatarsal, which bear more weight than the rest of the bones. The arch also functions as a shock absorber. It also protects the enclosed structures like the muscles, tendons, nerves and vessels. So, disruption of the arch can lead on to pressure symptoms in any of these structures, leading on to compression, pain and associated anomalies. The arch is also dynamic and pliable. In other words, once when the arch is resting, when the foot is resting on the ground, it remains more or less collapsed with the whole foot touching the ground. Once when it takes off, the arch retains its contour, maintains the arch and functions. So, thereby it acts as a springboard and helps in the takeoff function of the foot. Coming on to the classification of arches, they are longitudinal and transverse. The longitudinal, there is the medial longitudinal arch and the lateral longitudinal arch. Transverse comprises of the anterior one, which is complete, and the posterior one, which is incomplete or a semi arch. Talking about the components of the arch, it has bones, the ends which might be anterior or posterior or medial or lateral, the summit of the arch, which is the highest point of the arch. Then there are the pillars which support the arch, which might be anterior or posterior or again medial and lateral, and the main joint which is responsible for maintaining the contour of the arch. This is very clearly evident in the various components as is shown, showing the arch form with the anterior and posterior ends and the pillars, the summit of the arch which might be contributed by one of the bones forming the arch, and the main joint which helps in maintaining the arch function. So, the arch can be compared to a bridge whereby all these elements come into play. Similar to what we have in the bridge, the arch also can be compared to have bony factors, that is the shape of the bones which maintain the arch, or in other words, if you look at the bridge, the composition of the arch, the way it is built, the tie beams or the bowstrings, that are the structures that will be holding the arch from end to end, and then there are the intersegmental tires or the staples that we call it, which will be holding the adjacent structures, and this is a suspension elements, that is in the form of slings or suspension factors, which are the structures which hold the arch from above or support it from a lower level. Most of these structures, the tie beams, staples and the suspension bridges, are constituted by the various ligaments and muscles that form part of the foot and thereby support the arch in its formation and function in different ways. Coming on to the medial longitudinal arch, that can be considered as a big arc of a small circle. I will tell it once again, I have to come this way. Coming on to the medial longitudinal arch, it can be considered as a big arc of a small circle. So, thereby you see that the height or the summit of the arch is elevated. The various bones forming the arch are calcaneum, talus, navicular, the 3 cuneiform bones and the medial 3 metatarsal bones. Coming on to the ends of the arch, the anterior end is formed by the heads of the 3 metatarsal bones, the posterior end is formed by the medial tubercle of the calcaneus, and the summit, that is the height of the arch, is formed by the superior articular surface of the trochlea of the talus, which is the keystone of this arch. Coming on to the pillars, at the anterior end, the pillar is long, oblique and weak, formed by the talus, navicular, the cuneiforms and the metatarsal bones. The posterior pillar of the arch is short, vertical and strong, formed by the medial half of the calcanean bone. The main joint of this arch is talocalcaneo-navicular joint. Coming on to the bony factors that maintain the medial longitudinal arch. It is the wedge-shaped nature of the bones, so much so the pointed end or the narrow end of the bone lies towards the plantar side and the dorsal part of it is formed by the broad end of the bone. So, all this helps in maintaining or aligning the structure as such. The sustentaculum tali of the calcaneus, the reciprocal nature of the bones, that is the navicular articulating with the talus and the navicular with the cuneiform, and the keystone is basically the talar head. Basically, you find that multiple bones are involved in the medial longitudinal arch. So, resiliency is the main feature of this arch. Coming on to the intersegmental ties or the various structures that will hold the arch together, they are the spring ligament or plantar calcaneo-navicular ligament, the tibialis posterior tendon as it passes down for its insertion, or the various interosseous ligaments that connect the adjacent bones. So, we do have both dynamic and passive support for the maintenance of this arch. Coming on to the tiebeams or the structures that will be holding it from the anterior to the posterior end, we have the medial aspect of the plantar aponeurosis and the various long muscles that are attached from end to end. For instance, the abductor hallucis, flexor hallucis longus and brevis, and flexor digitorum longus and brevis, the medial part of that. Coming on to the slings or the structures that will hold on to the or support the arch, we have the tibialis anterior and the upper fibers of the deltoid, which has a sling effect from above, and the tibialis posterior by virtue of its attachment to the bone and to the adjacent bones of the talus and the metatarsals gives a sustentacular action or supports it from below. Coming on to the lateral longitudinal arch, that is considered as a small arc of a large circle. So much so, the height of the arch is very less and it has a, I will repeat it once again. Now, coming on to the lateral longitudinal arch, it is to be considered as a small arc of a large circle. So much so, the summit or the height of the arch is very small. The bones forming the arch are the calcaneus, cuboid, and the lateral two metatarsals, that is the fourth and the fifth metatarsal bones. The ends, the anterior end of it is formed by the head of these two metatarsals, that is the fourth and the fifth metatarsal, whereas the posterior end is formed by the medial tubercle of the calcaneus. The summit of the arch is formed by the superior surface of the calcaneo, I have to repeat this, the summit of the arch is formed by the superior surface of the calcaneum, where we have the subtalar joint. The main joint of this arch is the calcaneo-cuboid arch. The pillars of the arch, the anterior pillar, like the medial longitudinal arch, is again long, oblique and weak, formed by the cuboid bone and the metatarsal bones fourth and the fifth. The posterior pillar, being formed of the calcaneus, is vertical, short and strong. The bony factors that maintain the lateral arch is the calcaneal angle of the cuboid. This is a small triangular projection of bone in the inferior border of the cuboid on the proximal articular surface of the cuboid that rests on the upper surface of the anterior articular surface of the cuboid. Sorry, I have to repeat it. The structures maintaining the lateral longitudinal arch, the bony factors include the calcaneal angle of cuboid, which is a small triangular projection of bone found on the inferior surface of the cuboid on the proximal articular surface of the cuboid. This rests on the upper portion of the anterior articular surface of the calcaneum. This gives a upward tilt to the long axis of the calcaneum and helps in the maintenance of the arch. The keystone is the cuboid bone over here, and the intersegmental ties or the various structures that hold the arch together are the long and short plantar ligaments on the plantar aspect. The structures maintaining the lateral longitudinal arch, let us talk about the bony factors. The main factor is the calcaneal angle of the cuboid, which is a small triangular piece of bone on the inferior border of the anterior articular surface of the cuboid, and this rests on the upper part of the anterior articular surface of the calcaneum. This by and large gives an upward tilt to the long axis of the calcaneum and thereby helps in the maintenance of the lateral arch. The keystone to this arch is the cuboid bone, and the intersegmental ties which holds the ends of the arch are the long and short plantar ligaments which are found on the plantar surface of the sole. Coming on to the tiebeams or the structures holding the arch together, we have the plantar aponeurosis, the lateral half of it, and the various muscles like abductor digiti minimi, the lateral portion of the flexor digitorum longus and brevis, and flexor digiti minimi muscles. The slings or the supports acting from above are the peroneus brevis and tertius muscles, and the peroneus longus by way of its attachment to the under surface gives a sustentacular action. So, looking at the lateral longitudinal arch, we realize that it has got lesser bones and joints to participate. So, rigidity becomes the main feature of the arch, and the lateral arch flattens out at the hinge surface between the cuboid and the basis of the metatarsal, so much so that it bears the weight of the body before the medial arch acts. Now, let us look at the transverse arches. The anterior arch is a complete one formed only by the heads of the metatarsals. So, they touch the ground end to end, whereas the posterior one is an incomplete one in the sense that it forms only half the arch and the arch becomes complete by the other half in the other foot. Thereby it becomes a complete dome. It is formed by the bases of the metatarsal bones, the cuboid and the cuneiforms. It is the lateral end that touches the ground. Looking at the various factors that support the arch, let us look at the bony factors, which is quite important. It is the wedge shaped nature of the cuneiforms and in relation to the middle three metatarsals that hold the transverse arch together. The tie beam is formed of the peroneus longus and tibialis posterior as it goes for their insertion onto the plantar aspect of the foot. The sling action is exerted by the peroneus tertius and brevis muscles from the lateral aspect. Coming on to the intersegmental ties that holds the different aspects of the transverse arch, we have the various muscles and ligaments that are there, that is the deep transverse metatarsal ligament, tibialis posterior and peroneus longus tendons, various plantar muscles at their origin, dorsal interossei and abductor hallucis. So, having seen the arches, let us look at what are the clinical aspects or what happens once when the arches do not function well. So, flat foot or pes planus is the collapse of the longitudinal arch. This was what we had considered in our clinical scenario. So, what happens there? Multiple reasons for the collapse of the arch, that is once when there is a rapid increase in body weight, an improper distribution of the weight can lead on to a flattening, or it can be a loss in the tone of the leg muscles which can happen due to prolonged standing or fatigue. All this can lead on to flattening of the arch. Same time, you would have noticed that the newborns do have a flat foot. This is because of the subcutaneous fat deposition, and they develop their foot or they develop their arch only once when they start walking, when the muscles regain their tone, having looked at the arches, their formation, the way they are supported and maintained, let us look at what happens if this anatomy is disturbed or if there is a dysfunction to these arches. One of the commonest anomalies that we come across is the flat foot, or this was the same thing that we had in our clinical scenario. What happens there? Here there is collapse of the longitudinal arches, which can be due to various causes, when there is a rapid increase in body weight leading on to different distribution of the body weight, the arch can collapse, or when there is a loss of tone in the leg muscles due to prolonged standing or fatigue, the arches can collapse. We have seen that the newborns do have flat foot. This is because of the subcutaneous deposit of fat and their muscles are not well developed. So, as they start walking, the muscles get their tone, and then it is only by 1 year or so the arches start developing in the newborns. Yet another condition is the hallux valgus, where there is an addition. Let me repeat. Yet another condition is the hallux valgus, where there is adduction of the great toe towards the midline. Undue prominence of the medial part of the metatarsal head occurs. There can be a coexisting bunion or a bursa in the subcutaneous tissue, which adds on to the pain and discomfort in the foot. Yet another abnormality that we see is pes cavus, where unlike the flat foot, this is the reverse, where there is the exaggeration of the long arch. The plantar flexion happens at the transverse tarsal joint. So, the anterior part of the foot drops much below the level of the posterior part. So much so, it is only the toes that touch the ground, and you have the impression of the heel as well. The middle part of the foot does not touch or does not leave behind an impression. Yet another abnormality that we see is the so called march fracture, where there is a continuous strain of the neck of the intermediate metatarsals, which leads on to decalcification and eventually leading on to pathological fracture at the neck. This is very often seen in soldiers after a prolonged period of sedentary life. When they start marching or walking fast, there may be a fracture happening, and that is why it is called as march fracture. Yet another entity that we commonly see, or very often one of the commonest anomalies that we come across, is the clubfoot, which is referred to as talipes equinovarus. There are different entities to that, different variations and combinations are there. Talipes equinus is where the foot is plantar flexed, so that only the tips of the toes touch the ground on movement. It is something equivalent to a horse galloping. Next entity is the talipes calcaneus, where the foot is dorsiflexed at the angle, so that it is a calcaneus portion of the foot that touches the ground and the toes are upturned. The third variety is the talipes varus, like something like what we see, where the foot is inverted and adducted at the subtalar and talocalcaneal joints. The reverse of that is the talipes valgus, where the foot is everted and abducted. So, talipes equinovarus may have combinations of any of this at different levels, and there are various reasons attributed to this anomaly. The muscle growth fails to keep pace with the skeletal growth. So, there is a lot of disparity, or there can be an imbalance in the growth of the different muscles or tendons, leading on to shortening of various elements and producing disproportionate arches. Thank you.